Well, hello, everybody. I really appreciate everyone joining us again this afternoon. As Patty Jean said, this is the fourth in our series of Hunger Summits that celebrate our food bank's 40th anniversary. Feeding America West Michigan was started back in 1981 by a pastor named Don Eddy, who saw a number of carrots being piled up on the side of the road in a nearby farm, and decided to go ask if he could collect them and give them to those in need. And that launched what is now today Feeding America West Michigan. So we're very excited to celebrate our 40th year of supporting our community. And for those that may not be aware, we serve the west side of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan and all of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So we have a lot of area, and we're very honored to have around 900 different partners that help us make sure that folks in all 40 counties we serve have enough to eat. And today we are just really excited and pleased to have Dr. Diane Whitmore Schanzenbach with us today. Diane is a leading economic expert in food assistance programs and food insecurity. She is regularly quoted in media outlets, some amazing outlets like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR. She's testified in Washington before the Senate and the House of Representatives on her research regarding the SNAP program. During COVID-19, she emerged as a leading academic voice on food hardship during a pandemic-induced recession, which we're kind of happy to see us getting beyond that a bit. So we're excited about that. Dr. Schanzenbach is a director of the Institute for Policy Research and professor of education and social policy at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. She is formerly the director of the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution. She graduated from Wesley College with a BA in economics and religion, and went on to receive her master's and PhD in economics from Princeton University. She is an elected member of the National Academy of Education and the National Academy of Social Insurance. She also serves on the board of directors of the Greater Chicago Food Depository, which is a wonderful partner food bank in the Feeding America Network. And so I could go on because I've got like 5 pages of things about you, Dr. Schanzenbach, but I am wanting to make sure we can get to your discussion today. So please, with me, warmly welcome Dr. Diane Whitmore Schanzenbach to our forum today. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I definitely send greetings from all of us at the Greater Chicago Food Depository, and commend you for the work that you're doing to feed your neighbors. So I was asked to talk about the importance of food assistance and fighting hunger, as if it weren't intrinsically evident why this is important. But nonetheless, I've had a 20-year research career trying to measure the impacts of the work that we do together. And so I'm delighted to share some of this research to start, and then I'll transition to talk a little bit more about the situation during COVID. So just to set the stage, a very large share of people in the United States, and a particularly large share of children, live in households that struggle to provide their basic needs. On the left-hand side of the screen right now, you can see the poverty rate over time. And we've been measuring that in a relatively consistent manner all the way back to 1959. We don't yet have the new number that will show an elevated rate due to COVID. We're still sort of measured in the pre-COVID time period. You can see the purple line is overall poverty. And prior to the pandemic, about 1 in 10 households in the United States was experiencing poverty. Children or families with children experience poverty at higher rates, about 14% prior to the pandemic. And we're expecting to see all of those numbers come up pretty substantially, I would predict, when the new numbers come out. I also have shown you down here in green, it's the share of children who live below 50% of the poverty line, which is just a very impoverished amount, and little over 5% of households with children are experiencing an extremely low level of poverty. Now, on the right-hand side is the rate of food insecurity, which is an economic measure which says that you don't have the resources that you need to buy the types of food that you'd like to have to live an active and healthy lifestyle. So food insecurity includes both hunger, as we think about it, but then also concepts like we weren't able to buy fresh fruit this month because we didn't have enough money, or we ran out of milk and had to do powdered milk, things like that. You can see the rate of food insecurity overall actually looks relatively similar to poverty, although the overlap between people who are experiencing food insecurity and poverty is far from perfect. About 10% of households in the United States were experiencing food insecurity prior to the pandemic. Higher rates for those with children. And then that bottom line is measuring what we would think of as hunger. The Department of Agriculture terms it as very low food security. And you can see again, about little less than 5% of households with children are experiencing, this very low level of resources. So just to set the stage a little bit, I wanted to show you a snapshot of our various social safety net programs and how they work to alleviate poverty. So there's a lot of information on this, and then I promise to get to some easier slides, coming up. I've broken this into 4 different groups. The yellow is elderly people. The blue is children, and then I think about prime age adults in 2 categories: those with children in green, and those without children in sort of the kind of a brown color. So just to sort of start, you can see that Social Security, which actually has to be on its own axis, it reduces poverty by 35% among the elderly, and that is our really #1 nationwide program in terms of reducing poverty, but it's primarily targeted to the elderly. The rest of the social safety net programs are, to the left here. The programs that lift the most prime age people and children out of poverty are the Earned Income Tax Credit, which tops up earnings for people with low wages, and then the child tax credits. Now, hopefully many of you know that starting this month, there's temporary, which we're hoping will be permanent, shift in the child tax credit, where it'll be fully refundable, which means low-income people who traditionally have not gotten any or not the full child tax credit will get the full amount, and then it'll be paid out monthly. And so for scholars of the safety net like me, we're really excited to try to understand, how is this going to impact material deprivation, like food insecurity, et cetera. Then sort of moving to the right, the next most important is SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It reduces the rate of poverty among children by about 2%, a little less than that, for adults, but sort of across the board, it's playing a really important anti-poverty role for all types of people, elderly, childless, with children. And then you can, I'll just sort of briefly go through the supplemental security income, housing assistance, the school lunch program. Each have, important anti-poverty components that are smaller than others. TANF, which used to be known as, or which you think of as cash welfare, today has a relatively small anti-poverty impact. Unemployment insurance, of course, varies. It will have a much bigger anti-poverty impact over the last 2 years than it has in prior years. And then finally, the Women, Infants, and Children Special Supplemental Nutrition Program that's aimed at pregnant women and then children up to their 5th birthday also reduces poverty, but at a much smaller amount. So really, when we think about anti-poverty, for prime age people, there's 2 big workhorses: the Earned Income Tax Credit and then SNAP. So what I'm going to briefly go over this this research that I want you all to hear about, which asks the question, what is the impact of alleviating poverty, is helping our neighbors meet their needs during early life? And this evidence comes from the introduction of the food stamp program. This is a map of the original introduction of the food stamp program. It was started as a pilot program in 1963. In a few states. It became a national or permanent program in 1965, and then counties on a county by county basis were allowed to adopt the program until it was made required to be national in 1975. So this map here with lighter colored counties adopted the program earlier, darker colored counties adopted it later, shows you the type of variation that we have. And then I, as a scholar, can come in and say, aha, since there's so much variation here, I bet we can learn something about what happened when we introduced SNAP. I'll just point out Michigan, really quickly to highlight it. Michigan, we would consider a good state from the perspective of from my perspective as a researcher, because there's a lot of variation. Some counties adopted the program very early, others adopted it much later. And so that means that we can really get in and compare what happened to people in different neighboring counties, and some that had food stamps, some that did not.
Diane, can I interrupt?
Of course.
There was a question from Joseph Jones that says, how much does the structure of the program have on its impact on poverty, i.e. TANF 25 years ago versus TANF today?
Yeah, so great questions. So SNAP, let me start with SNAP because it's always the place I want to start, is designed so that when families lose their job, when they hit hardship, when they have less income, they can go and sign up for SNAP quite promptly. And a little bit later, when we get into the work during COVID, you'll see that in Michigan, very quickly, the SNAP rolls increased by 15 or 20% because families lost their jobs, lost that income. Now, on the other hand, TANF 25 years ago used to have a similar setup to SNAP, that it would expand when there were hard times. But when we ended welfare as we know it, back in 1997, I think, 1996, we switched it to a block grant. And so that means that states get the same amount of money, whether times are good or times are bad, to use to alleviate need for families that are eligible for TANF. Hopefully it's intuitive why that's not a good idea, right? We've seen, in practice, that I imagine many of you have experienced large increases in need in your communities. Well, and hopefully you responded by having more resources, more food to share with your neighbors. That's not how TANF works anymore. And so what that means is it doesn't help, when poverty is increased. And I could, in fact, I do at Northwestern give a whole quarter-long course where we dive into each of the different, examples of this and sort of talk about, how they're structured. In general, we like to have programs that are structured so that they can expand in bad times and, scale back in good times. And which is how SNAP is designed. And let me briefly go through this sort of path-breaking work on the long-term impacts of having access to SNAP in early life. So here, I'm not going to show you too many equations. I'm going to sort of do it in the cartoon version, which is the topic of this paper was the impacts of SNAP on low-income families in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. So we've got two families. We're going to compare different families that live in the same state, but live in different counties. Like I showed, on the map, you could see, in Michigan, there were people in different counties had different exposure to SNAP in the 1960s and 1970s. So one family gets extra resources. You can see there, she's got some money in her hand, starting, and we'll just put a number on it, in 1967, because of the county that they live in. Where the other family lives in a different county in the same state, and the program doesn't start for them until 1972. And so what we can do then is compare the impacts of having access to this program across families, but then also across siblings based on the age at which they first started receiving these extra resources. So you can see, as I've drawn this, one sibling is still in utero, the mom's pregnant, and then we've got an age 2, older sister, and an age 8 older brother. So we can ask the question, what's the impact of having these extra resources, just period, but then also at the different ages that we see. So we've got this family starting in 1967, when the youngest was not yet born, and then a 2-year-old and an 8-year-old. And then we can fast forward and measure them all the way out to the year 2006, when which feels like a long time ago now, but paper took a long time to write. So they were ages 39, 41, and 47. And then we can ask the questions, what are the impacts of having these extra resources in early life on adult health, on their economic success? And then also, how does that vary by the age at which they received this poverty alleviation, this help with nutrition assistance? And then we can do the same thing with the comparison family. In 1967, they were not yet born, age 2 and age 8. We could come forward to think about them in adulthood, knowing that eventually they did get access to SNAP benefits, but not until 1972, when that youngest was 5 years old. So we can make this comparison. So we're comparing these two sets of siblings in adulthood, one that had more resources for several additional years because of the introduction of the food stamp program, and just ask these questions about adult health, economic success, and how that varied across the siblings. So before I get to the adults, I want to start by explaining that the very first thing we did was look at birth outcomes to see, what happened in 1967 when the program was introduced, what happened to babies born in 1968 and 1969. And something that's really nice about there are two things that are really nice at looking at birth outcomes. One is that we measure it very comprehensively. We've got this information about almost every single person that's been born. So we've got these sort of large sample sizes. The other is we can really look and make sure that it's food stamps that's doing the work here and not something else. So in particular, we can test to see, well, what happens if you were born in 1966, but food stamps didn't start until January 1st of 1967. If we were to find that it looked like food stamps increased your birth weight, we could tell something was wrong. And so we're able to do all of that and really show and convince our peers that we were able to isolate just the impact of these additional resources through food stamps. So just to start, we learned that food stamps improve birth weights for people who were in utero during the time that they were introduced. The impacts tends to be a little bit larger for Black families than for white families. And in particular, there's a very substantial reduction in the likelihood of being born at a low birth weight. And throughout this, we learned that the most disadvantaged, those who were most likely to be born at the lowest birth weights, get the largest benefits from alleviating hunger. And many of you might think, well, doesn't that just align with common sense? And indeed it does. But sometimes I guess that that's why they pay us the big bucks to to really sort of trace out the science. So making sure that pregnant women don't go hungry indeed improves their children's health at birth. But then we can also measure these long run effects, like I was talking about. I want to just take a minute to emphasize how unusual and how fortunate we were that we were able to do this, because we need lots of different pieces to come together. We need to have longitudinal data that allow us to look at adult circumstances. And I might just do a quick plug that the data here come from the panel study of income dynamics, which is housed at the University of Michigan and is just a tremendously important resource for researchers. You also need to have a credible research design, something that impacts some families, but not others, like we do in the food stamp introduction. And then, of course, you need time to pass. And so we were very fortunate that all of this work happened in the 1960s and 70s so that we could look at the long-term outcomes today. So I'll start, we sort of break the impacts into two different buckets. The first is health. And we find that in adulthood, children who had access to the food stamp program in early life, measured between conception and age 5, were much more likely to report that they were in good health. Now this, kind of interestingly, happens primarily for women, but then we can also look at biomarkers. So as part of this data that is collected at the University of Michigan, they also weigh and measure them, ask them questions like, has a doctor diagnosed you with diabetes? Have you had a heart attack, et cetera? So we can look at those, which are potentially more objective measures of health. We could pull all of those together into some bad health outcomes, which are called metabolic syndrome. And this scientists explain that having more reliable access to food in early life is theoretically predicted to reduce obesity in later life and heart attacks, things like that. So what we find here is quite sizable reductions in later life metabolic syndrome because children were fed with more adequacy in early life. So that was a big deal finding when we established it. We can also look at economic outcomes. And here we term it economic self-sufficiency. It's a range of outcomes, including, are you employed? How much do you earn? Are you not in poverty? Are you not on food stamps yourself? And here, again, we find very strong impacts, especially for women. The one for men you can barely see in green there. But the impacts for women are quite substantial. So what this means is that investing in making sure that they had adequate amounts to eat in their early life pays off in the long run through improved education outcomes, more employment in adulthood. In fact, we find that these women are less likely to be on food stamps themselves as adults because we made these investments during childhood so that then they could pay better attention in school and complete more school, et cetera. So this has been a really exciting set of research findings. I'll talk a little bit, put it in some more context, but let me just spend one more minute thinking about the timing here as well. So this relates the timing when the food stamp program was introduced to the impact on that bad outcome of metabolic syndrome. So you can think about this as reduction in things like obesity. In the blue range, the children are exposed to food stamps before birth. So either in utero or sort of getting mom a little bit more healthy before she conceives. The green is exposure to food stamps in early childhood through ages 1 to about 5. And then the pink or orange is in later childhood. Now we find slightly different impacts when it comes to economic outcomes, but let me focus here on the health outcomes. And because we think they're real biological sort of windows that are open and shut at later points that are related to depravity in early life. So what we find is the earlier the better. So there's the largest bang for the buck is making sure that mom or the child in utero have enough resources. Then there continue to be strong positive impacts in early life. Now, just for the health, we do find that that the window to affect long-term health closes in childhood. And we don't find that, but I don't have quite as pretty of a picture for the economic outcomes. In fact, what we find is, if you start providing food stamps to someone at age 12 or 15, they're more likely to graduate from high school. The impacts are even larger if you start this relief earlier at age 8 or age 3. But nonetheless, you sort of the results always go the way that you would intuit that they would. Now, briefly, I'll mention that this paper that I wrote with Hilary Hoynes at the University of California, Berkeley, sparked off a number of similar papers where other researchers were able to find ways to look at other programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit or Medicaid health insurance. And what we're able to do as a whole literature is show, I think quite convincingly, that alleviating poverty, especially for children, leads to long-term impacts. And of course, that's not entirely surprising, but I want because of course, we think about childhood as a time that we're investing in kids' schooling and their brains, but then also in their physical capabilities. And I wanted to share this with you all and the work that you do, so that of course, you can see the short-term, positive impacts that you're making by alleviating hunger in the short run. But I also wanted you to understand that there are these long-run important impacts of making sure that our neighbors and especially our children have enough to eat. So before I sort of turn to the situation in COVID, I thought I'd take a minute and see if there are other questions, because I know I can talk a lot. It's an occupational hazard for professors.
Diane, currently there aren't any questions.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, so hopefully, feel free to follow up. Let me talk a little bit about the COVID experience. Here I have for you 2 measures of food hardship that have been collected throughout the pandemic in Michigan and nationwide, but I showed you Michigan because I thought you'd be most interested in that. The purple is this broader concept of food insecurity. You have to do a little bit of sort of massaging of the data to get to food insecurity, which I'm happy to tell you more about. And the green line is hunger. So in the most recent data, which extend through June 7th, the rate of hunger, and that's families saying that I sometimes or often didn't have enough to eat last week, was just under 7% in the state of Michigan. The broader concept of food insecurity was about 15%. But you can see, going back to earlier days of the pandemic, we saw, I would characterize these levels that we're seeing now as high, but we saw levels that were much higher, 25% for food insecurity, 13% for hunger. These are just measured in the last week, right? So a nice piece about this set of data is you can see, shifts, dramatic changes. We've been tracking to see, does food hardship decline when the unemployment rate goes down, et cetera. In fact, you can even see the sharp drops when the stimulus payments went out. So when families got those additional dollars, it helped them, pay for their groceries. And so we saw sharp drops both in Michigan and nationwide in terms of experiencing food hardship. And just so you have it, the solid lines here were the average in the state of Michigan prior to the pandemic, between 2017 and 2019. And so you can see that, on average, food insecurity was about 12.5% in Michigan prior to the pandemic. And so, it's still elevated relative to that. It got quite elevated at the peak. And then hunger in Michigan is prior to the pandemic was just under 5%. And so, we're up at about 7% now. So food insecurity and hunger are certainly elevated. They have come down in recent weeks, but they are high. This is what food insecurity in June looked like in Michigan, overall, and for families with children, overall, and then for different racial and ethnic groups. In general, what we find, and I do not know what happened to whites on this. They have just disappeared. So I apologize for that, but what I can tell you, and I can send you a follow-up with it, typically Blacks have about twice the rates of food hardship as whites. And so, we see, I think, also, great disparity in Michigan, which is quite typical. I think every state sees very, very similar things. But, we are seeing still rates for for Hispanic or Latino families with children. Still 1 in 3 are reporting that they experienced food insecurity of their prior week. So while there has been great success, there are still pockets of tremendous distress. Now, I'm an economist by training, so I would not want to pretend that food happens sort of in isolation. This is sort of the tip of the iceberg, and many families are also really struggling. Right here, I've shown being behind on housing payments. And you can see that in June, 1 in 10 Black adults in Michigan said that they were currently behind on their housing payments, right? So the economic distress is still very substantial, even though we have seen great progress in recent weeks. The data that are being released every other week by the Census Bureau stopped collecting this information back in March, and so that's the most recent I can give you. And this is national data. This is Michigan data. I apologize for the sort of confusion. About 5% of Michiganders with children report that they had received free food from a food bank or food pantry in the prior week. About more than 8% of Hispanic or Latinos. When I show numbers like this to food bankers, they often think, gosh, it seems like these are underreported. But I will tell you from, compared to history, these numbers are jaw-dropping. They're very high. Michigan is seeing more receipt of free food from food banks or food pantries than the national average. So, if you're tired, I think that's legit, because it sure looks like you're doing a lot of relief work. So let me take a step back to sort of paint the picture of other parts of the relief packages. So I'm a scholar who primarily studies the food stamp program, which is called SNAP. So I wanted to show you, to start, just at the beginning, we talked a little bit about how SNAP is designed to automatically increase or allow people to sign up for it as their incomes fall. The solid line here is nationwide. The dotted line is the state of Michigan. It goes back to February 2020 and then shows monthly. The red lines are the dollars that have come to Michigan or to the United States. And then the purple are the number of people on the programs. And so just to take a minute, comparing Michigan to the United States overall, Michigan was sort of the talk of, sort of the darling of everyone right at the beginning of the pandemic, because you all were so quick to respond, both in terms of increasing your SNAP rolls, and also in a little bit I'll come to, you were the first state off the block to pay those extra benefits for missed school meals, the pandemic EBT payments. But then you can see, somewhat puzzling, the share of, or the increase in people on SNAP declined, whereas you still can, steadily rose across the rest of the United States. Those of us in the research community had noticed this for quite some time and have been asking, the state, why are we seeing these numbers decline? They don't have a really good answer. And so, depending on whether you want your glass half empty or half full, to be sure, still SNAP has increased. It's up. The number of people on SNAP is up 10% relative to prior to the pandemic. Or if you would like your glass half empty, you might ask, why were we so fast, off the gate, but then we've seen this decline? Similarly, we can look at dollars, and you can see a pretty similar pattern in terms of dollars. A lot of dollars came out of the gate. This big increase is driven by two different things. One is the fact that more people are on SNAP, but the other is that we've changed how we're paying out SNAP. And so prior to the pandemic, you would get a SNAP allotment that was related to how much your income was. And then during the pandemic, we've said, no, everybody's going to get the maximum benefit. And then even in recent months, the Biden administration has pushed that up a little bit more. So that was a very efficient and effective way of getting dollars out to low-income families. And you might say, but didn't just a minute ago, you show us how elevated food hardship is. And both of these things are true at the same time. Things would have been worse if it weren't for the historic response by SNAP.
And I have two questions.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I see some questions popping up.
Yeah. So the first one is, how can food banks and other hunger relief agencies support programs like SNAP? That's question number one.
Great. Well, I can tell you what we do here in Chicago, and I would recommend the same. So we've got a multi-pronged approach. One is we are pretty aggressive with our benefits outreach to people who are coming into the food banks and food pantries who might be eligible. We help them with the application. We make sure that they know about it, know how to navigate that system. And in Chicago, we have found that to be really, really helpful for a couple of reasons. One is that, Feeding America likes to cite the statistic that for every meal that Feeding America provides, SNAP provides, I think, 8. I should know the statistic better. But second, we find in Chicago that when you can take the edge off a little bit, when people have the SNAP resources, then we can serve others more effectively. So for example, fully a third of people who experience food insecurity have incomes that are too high to participate in SNAP. And so for those families, really, food banks and food pantries are the only source of food relief when they get into trouble. So we find that, by helping families that are eligible get on SNAP, that helps us just with a little more bandwidth so that we can help the folks who are not part of this. The other part of the strategy, that was sort of a dive into the first part of the strategy. The second is, we make sure to tell our elected officials every time we can about the importance of our work and the work of the SNAP program and how those function together like hand in glove.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what can food banks and other hunger relief agencies do to help increase long-term food insecurity or long-term food security?
Right, stop in the insecurity part. Right. I can tell you a few things. So when you look at any one point in time at people who are food insecure, about half of them experience food insecurity pretty persistently, sort of year after year. But about half of them don't, right? And so they are, sort of down their luck. They had a job loss, they got hit with a medical bill, whatever it is. And so, of course, you need to have different strategies with the two different groups. And of course, it's not that people come with that label on their forehead. There's some work you have to do to help understand. So we find here in Chicago that again, sort of when the pressure is off a little bit, when we're not in the midst of a pandemic, we can be more creative in terms of helping families get access to job training, helping with some of those more holistic supports. A lot of our partner food banks are nested within organizations that also offer either job training or mental health help, substance abuse, et cetera. And so we also find that strengthening those partnerships make a lot of sense. So I hope that answered the question. I'm sure that, I'm sure that the folks on the ground have, lots of smart ideas along that as well. But I think the general idea is to, is to know that we cannot food bank our way out of this crisis or any other, but food banks are just such a key player. And so we need to, be coordinating as best as we can. So with SNAP, the response has been strong. Let me talk a little bit about pandemic EBT, again, because Michigan was such a star in that. So something that we had just underappreciated prior to this pandemic was how important school meals are. Because of course, we've never been in a situation before, other than summers, which we can plan for, where the kids didn't have access to school meals. And so you probably remember at the beginning of the pandemic, probably many of you were working to try to get the bagged lunches, the boxed meals to schools so that families could pick them up. Congress also enacted a program that provided things like SNAP benefits called the Pandemic EBT program that provided about $5 per child per school day missed, and got those dollars out, and so you could use it to buy food at the grocery store. So I've shown you another map here with timing, and you can see Michigan is it was the very first here in the mint color, but there's a lot of different colors here, which represents different timing of introduction. So this maybe will harken back to you from my earlier slide, which showed the variation in food stamps. Well, anytime we see variation like this, we think, oh, this will allow us to do a real strong study to see, well, what's the impact of having these additional payments on food hardship. So we were able to do it. Now the truth is, Michigan acted so quickly that they didn't get to stay in our study because, but that, good news for people, bad news for the research. What we learned is that when families got these pandemic EBT payments, the cards that were worth about $5 a day, food hardship in the next 2 weeks dropped substantially by about a third across the board. And so even the most broad measure of food insecurity, more narrow measures of hunger, and even we've been collecting information during the pandemic about hunger that children experience. Now, usually families, of course, do everything they can to protect their children from experiencing hunger. And, in normal times, the rate of children, going a day without eating or skipping meals is quite low because of all the work that we do together to combat this. Well, during the pandemic, we've seen even those rates of children not having enough to eat be quite high. And, and we learned that these benefits reduced all the different measures of food hardship by about a third. Now, the bad news, of course, was that some states, Nebraska, Colorado, didn't get their payments out until even July, and so the kids went, for weeks. Families went for weeks and weeks and weeks without having these benefits. But then when they finally got them, we scrambled to get this research done in time for Congress to consider reauthorizing the pandemic EBT program, and they did that back in September. But you might remember that. Even though we saw record rates of food hardship, that those dollars were stuck in Washington. It didn't start flowing again to states until relatively recently. And so that was, some bad news. Anytime we see a program that is effective, we need to be using it. So from here, I get even more depressing. So I hope that's okay. I did start with the good news that alleviating hunger has long-term effects, but let me tell you a little bit about what to expect going forward. So just to start, this is what's happened to the unemployment rate over the last few months. The solid line is the United States overall. The dotted line is Michigan. Michigan spiked higher than the rest of the United States, but the good news is you've seen your unemployment rate come down even more. than the national unemployment rate. But it is just a documented fact with recessions that some groups experience higher spikes of unemployment and a slower decline in unemployment. And those groups include Blacks and Hispanics, also women. And we are seeing that this time as well, as you would expect. And so these are just the national rates. You can see even prior to the pandemic, even though we had quite low unemployment rates, they were always more elevated for Blacks and Hispanics. They spiked higher for Blacks and Hispanics. And then that tail is going to be our expectation is it will be longer for them. It's also traditionally longer for people with just high school diplomas and some college. So all of this sort of means that even if we think that the recession is mostly behind us as a nation, the pockets of neighbors that we serve are going to be harmed by this for longer. So let me do a little bit of a history lesson for you. So this is sort of all of the recent recessions back to the one in 1980. And the vertical axis shows how much employment declined during the recession. And then the horizontal axis is the number of months since the recession started. And so you can see, that one in 1980 was a relatively small decline. And we regained the jobs within a year. That 81, 82 recession took us more like a little over 2 years to regain the jobs. And, we lost more of them. The early 90s recession, the 2000 recession, took us 4 years to regain jobs, but we didn't lose that many. We sort of were down about 2%. So now let me show you the Great Recession. Right, we lost about 6% of jobs by the time all was said and done. And it took us almost a decade to regain all the jobs that were lost. In a minute, I'm going to show you that there were some places geographically that didn't even regain all the jobs that were lost within a decade. So now we can see what COVID looks like. So here we are out 16, 17 months since the beginning. We've regained a lot of jobs, but what we don't yet know is, how much longer is it going to take us to get back to the starting point? Is it going to continue to rise really quickly, or are we going to be more on the 4-year, hopefully not 10-year path? So what I've been telling my colleagues on the front lines of this is that we need to be prepared for a long tail on this. And for those of you who were around during the Great Recession, we had a long tail on that one too. So here I'm coming back to just US food insecurity rates. And I've drawn 2 vertical lines, one at the beginning of the Great Recession. You can see here, blue is all households. We saw a sharp increase in food insecurity, and that remained elevated for a long time. In fact, it didn't come back to its pre-recession rate for 10 years. For households with children, it was elevated, but came back down after more like 6 years. You can see here that for households with at least one senior, we've never regained to our pre-recession levels. So that's sort of somber news, reminding you that as sort of life is getting rapidly back to normal in many places, it's going to take a while longer. Now I skipped this one, and just because Michigan, I thought I'd spend a second. So one more sort of deep dive into the economics of job regrowth. This showed after 10 years after the Great Recession, how much did employment come back after adjusting for demographic shifts, the aging of the population, things like that. You can see that Michigan sort of led the nation after 10 years in terms of getting their jobs back. I imagine that a lot of you are sort of looking around your community and saying, you've got to be kidding me, right? That we were, because, there are pockets of real distress. But when you look at other states, even after 10 years, they didn't regain all the jobs that they lost. So again, that's just sort of sombering sort of way to end, on the feel bad note, that, we're expecting to see, just the ramifications of this recession for years to come. So that on that is, a sad note, is where I was going to leave it. I'd love to answer any other questions as they come. I'll stop my screen share.
There's not some coming in. I have like a whole list. But,
Excellent.
I want to make sure our audience has a chance to weigh in.
Why don't you go ahead, Ken?
So just back earlier on, you were talking about the impact of early childhood, having access to food resources and the like. I'm wondering, in your SNAP research, the structure of the way the program is set up, based on your data, it would seem very compelling to emphasize SNAP assistance specifically towards young children, pregnant moms, and things like that. And I'm wondering, have you seen any movement in how the SNAP program is being structured in a way that matches the data in the study that you've done relative to that early childhood impact?
We are really seeing movement in this area. Ours is not the only study that shows this real importance of early life. And so, for example, the new child tax credit, which is starting to get paid out monthly this month, provides more resources to younger families with younger children. And that was something that was a feature both of the Republican plan and the Democrat plan. So I think, there's sort of a lot of buy-in, across the board that the research is correct, and it also fits into, what we know about brain development, et cetera. We have, my co-author and I have written a number of opinion pieces trying to talk people into topping up or increasing SNAP benefits, especially for families with young kids. And that hasn't happened yet, but we're still sort of out there, arguing for it because we think it's good policy. Now, the flip side, and something that I definitely want to make sure that that people who are on the ground understand is we have not seen. So I feel like the WIC program is really not met its potential, especially once you get out of that infant formula. So lots of families sign up for that first year where they're getting assistance with infant formula. Infant formula is extremely expensive. It's a very effective program for that. But then we see very steep drop-offs in participation in WIC, such that something like only a third of 4-year-olds who are eligible for WIC participate. Well, given what we know about how important it is to protect children at these ages and the high rates of suffering that they have, we need to frankly be getting more out of our WIC program. And so that is something that we as a food bank in Chicago try to work with, our local elected officials, just try to, get rid of the kinks in the system and make it more user friendly.
Thank you.
Diane, I have another question, and it says, can you speak about increased senior need in light of lost earning years during the Great Recession? How may that impact the idea that we never return to pre-recession levels of senior food insecurity and the long-term impact on these rates?
Yeah, I think we know less about the seniors than we should. They're, of course, extremely important. I think that is a really good theory about, why we never saw food insecurity come back down is they either got hit by, losing some of their retirement savings, or they had to retire early. And there's, once you do that, it's, really difficult to kind of impossible to make up for lost ground there. As a result, there are a few things that I think are important from a policy perspective to highlight to everyone. One is many states have implemented a simplified SNAP application process for the elderly. I don't know if Michigan is one of those or if it's statewide or not. Generally, we see participation rates in SNAP to be lower for elderly folks. And then we've learned that when they adopt a simplified application system, we can push those participation rates back up, and the elderly have less food hardship. Just to like put a little bit of common sense on that, normally people have to recertify every 6 months, every year, something like that for SNAP benefits. But for the elderly who are living on fixed income, it's very predictable, Social Security, et cetera, probably doesn't make sense that they need to keep recertifying at such short intervals because their incomes are very predictable. We can say, all right, we got you once and we can let you go for 2 years or 3 years or something like that. And so it's reforms like that I think make a lot of sense. The other is in recent years, there has been some thought about changing eligibility for SNAP. And this is just going to be a little bit in the weeds, but currently we allow elderly folks to have higher levels of assets, sort of with that same notion that, if we force people to spend down their assets before they get SNAP help, if you're elderly, you're not really going to be able to build those back up. And so we've offered sort of a more generous asset allowance to elderly folks on SNAP. That's always a little bit on the cusp. People think about, oh, we need to save a couple $2 billion, maybe we'll take that away. And I think it's a good policy to allow elderly folks to have more assets, and we should oppose taking that away in order to help combat senior hunger.
Great. Well, there are no other questions, and we're right about at time. It's 1:59. So if there aren't any other questions, I think I'm going to stop the recording, but would love to thank you for all your insight. This has been incredible.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Really